Some people think the flood myth is 10,000 years old, and some people think it's told by every culture around the world. And today I'm going to prove those thoughts wrong. When was the first story of the flood told, and where? Well, some people also say Noah's Ark or the Epic of Gilgamesh are the oldest flood stories. And this is just not true either. And the elements of Noah's Ark could actually be over 20, 30 or even 40,000 years old. And then there are many theories as to why flood myths are told all around the world. Some believe that there were, many different floods. Some believe that there was a global flood thousands of years ago. But, if there was it an event so terrible that affected all the civilizations on Earth in such a way that humans have never forgotten the story? Or were there thousands of little floods that were so common and so terrifying that these types of stories are just inevitable, to be told again and again by humans wherever they live? In this video, I'm going to trace the origins of the flood myth back to its earliest roots, deep in prehistory. And I'm going to do that by using mythology. And the reason for this is that using geological evidence alone to understand if there was a worldwide flood has its limitations. Yes, it can help evidence floods and natural disasters, but it also dehumanises the story. It doesn't let us understand why, where and when these stories began. And I'll show how we can use scientific methods in the study of folklore and mythology to allow us to understand why we tell flood myths and to place a whole new perspective on these tales that have shaped our past. And this is because many people have an inherent bias in believing that humans cannot tell the same story for many generations across thousands of years. They feel that the myths we tell are purely cultural invention. But I will show that some of the most well-known stories have been told for thousands of years, and some of them hold memories of a world lost that has suffered from floods and sea level rise, whilst others hold truths long forgotten to us today. I'm Jean-Loïc, a specialist in Indo-European mythology, and my work and research has helped students, academics and universities around the world understand the origins and age of the stories we tell. And so let me take you on a journey into the flood myth with a deluge of folklore and the odd cup of tea. And welcome to Quellec. There are many misconceptions floating around about flood mythology, which give rise to theories such as it was a consequence of the Younger Dryas period, when parts of the earth suddenly went cold, then warm, or it was due to the melting ice caps at the end of the last ice age. And these views can be convincing, and so some self-proclaimed ancient historians state that Noah's Ark was not only real but has been found. And if you believe in the early biblical stories, you feel those stories are true. You may again think that this could be possible. And so let me explain through examples the different kind of flood stories we tell as humans, and explain their differences. And once I've told these, we can get into the science of storytelling and the phylogenetic method to explain how we can predict the answer to where and why the flood myths happened. The stories ancient civilizations told about the flood, which are sometimes referred to as diluvian myths, meaning flood myths, well, these stories are sometimes cited by these self-proclaimed ancient history experts to suggest that there must have been a worldwide flood because the myth is so prevalent. They say that as there are stories from all around the world talking about a flood, and again, if you don't look too closely at the evidence, then this seems like it could be true, and if it was, it would be amazing. We also see various levels of geological experts talk of flooding events that were significant and which may well have been the cause of a worldwide flooding event. But perhaps we shouldn't ignore our written evidence, as there are many ancient texts that contain flood stories. The most well-known of these myths is Noah's Ark, found in the book of Genesis of the Bible. It is a story which most biblical scholars believe was written in the early 5th century BCE and tells of how God is not happy with how the world is turning out regarding humans and wants to restart. And so, in his all-loving way, he drowns most of the people and animals. And when the waters eventually disperse about a year later, and there is some debate about this, but it's around 370 days is the best guess, the world has been reset, and Noah and his children can then repopulate the world. But this is not our oldest written narrative about a flood. We have the Vedic flood myth, in which Manu, the man who is said to have been the start of the human family tree, and who has the same name as the first being in Indo-European creation mythology, well, he is warned by Vishnu, who is at the time reincarnated as a fish, small fish, that a flood is coming and that he should build a boat. Well, the flood comes and the fish, which has now grown in size, pulls the boat to safety. Now, once the flood waters recede, Manu can then perform a sacrifice to enable the human race to start again. And this story was probably written in the 6th century BCE. Now, we mustn't leave out the Greeks, who have flood stories written as far back as Hesiod's Theogony, which is in the 8th century BCE. And one flood story they have is probably best known via Ovid's Metamorphoses and is known as Deucalion's myth. And it has Zeus once again planning to destroy all humanity, which is something he hints at in the beginning of the Iliad, but this time not with war, but with a flood. And in this story, Deucalion is forewarned, usually by his father Prometheus, and so he builds an ark. And after 9 days and nights, the ark settles on the side of Mount Parnassus. Now, Deucalion and his wife visit the oracle of Themis and ask how to repopulate the earth. The answer is to throw the bones of their mother over their shoulders, which they interpret as casting stones, which are the bones of Mother Earth, because we see in much Indo-European cosmogony the bones and stones being homologous, and so these stones transform into humans, and so the earth can be populated again. And this story from the Greeks was being told hundreds of years before Noah's Ark was written down, but still we are not near the oldest story. Next, we have the fascinating flood myth in the Zoroastrian religion from Iran, in which the god Ahura Mazda warns Yima, who is the king, of a coming cosmic winter, which we can interpret as a flood, or perhaps it's better to say is analogous to a flood, and which will destroy all life on Earth. Rather than building an ark here, Yima is instructed to construct a palace or enclosure to preserve the seeds of humans, animals and plants. Yima, once the ideal king and guardian of the world, now becomes the preserver of creation, maintaining order while chaos reigns beyond the walls of his palace. This is interesting for many reasons, but primarily because it shows how Zoroastrianism was rewriting Indo-European mythology to try and change most things. And so floodwater becomes ice and the ark becomes an enclosure, which in itself means the story was probably being told long before it was written down in the 12th century BCE, which we can find in the Venidad II of the Zoroastrian Vestas. But now we come to the oldest written story in the world, And now there are older written texts, but this is the oldest story, and it is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written around 2000 BCE. In this story, the god Enlil is angered by humanity's noise and unruliness and decides to destroy mankind with a flood. But Ea, sometimes known as Enki, secretly warns Utnapishtim, and he instructs him to build a large boat and to bring aboard his family, craftsmen and important creatures. And then a flood occurs when a storm rages for 7 days and 7 nights. Now, once the waters recede and his boat settles on Mount Nisir, Utnapishtim releases 3 birds, a dove, a swallow and a raven. And when the raven does not return, it tells him that there must be dried land. And so he then offers a sacrifice, which pleases Enlil, and who, in turn, grants Utnapishtim and his wife immortality. When throwing all these myths together, we can see a very common thread, that the story has an angry god who wants to wipe out humans, but lets one survive, often along with his wife and some animals, and from this, humanity can start again. And so if you think the flood is true or not, then you also have to admit that it has been kept in oral tradition for thousands of years to survive from the journey of the Epic of Gilgamesh all the way through to Noah's Ark in the Bible. And that is assuming, taking into account it's gone via Iran and Greece in the meantime. This is really a clear indicator that oral tradition can keep the key parts of a story going, and these parts of a story we call mythemes. And I'll talk more about them, a little more later. But if you are interested in why stories can survive for tens of thousands of years in oral tradition, then I have this video on my channel. It is based on an essay I wrote at Oxford, if you want to have a deeper dive on the subject with lots of references. However, I also know there are many of you that do not believe there has not been a worldwide flood during the existence of modern man. And whilst some people will point out that sea levels have risen, by hundreds of feet, over 100 metres since the last glacial maximum, a sea level rise does not give rise to the type of flood story we have talked about so far. And let me explain why. If we examine the data, flood stories are told all around the world, or almost so, but I'll come back to that in a moment. But for now, if we are to assume that all these cultures did experience a worldwide flood in their past, then people who think this probably must have happened, it must have happened when people were already in the places where we find them today, such as across the Americas, and with the first migrations of humans into America happening between 25 and 15,000 years ago, based on current academic consensus, any worldwide flood must have happened after this for the people to have experienced it. And if we do use science and the geological record, then we can show that the only significant event regarding temperature changes on Earth that could have melted ice on polar caps and so raise sea levels is the Younger Dryas period. Well, strictly speaking, the time of the most rapid sea level rise is the time from the Bolin-Alerod interstadal event, which happened just before the Younger Dryas period. Here, evidence shows a 30-metre rise in sea levels, which is around 100 feet, in 1,500 years. Now, some people may imagine the sea levels rising 100 feet in an instant, comparing sea levels before rise and after rise. And if this was the case, many people would have drowned. It would have been a tragic event, even biblically tragic, worthy of a story that persisted through time. But that is not what happened. For while the sea level rise seems huge and we can naturally associate that happening rapidly, the actual event was a sea level rise that averaged less than an inch, a couple of centimetres per year. And even if it accelerated tenfold for a year, That's 20 centimetres or 7 inches. It is not enough to cause a global catastrophe overnight, not to an extent that the whole of the human race would talk about it across the world in their own separate stories about the same event. But this is what some people perceive the flood to have done, and yet there is just no geological evidence for this. And I'll come to the mythic evidence very soon, but what that supports for us now is that, there has been no catastrophic global flood event in the last 100,000 years, let alone the last sort of 25 to 15,000 years. Yes, there was a significant sea level rise if measured over hundreds of thousands of years. What flooding events could be considered tragic if there wasn't a global flooding event? Well, the answer is there were such events, and there still are local flooding events every year, and have been for as long as humans have been around. And knowing this, it does allow us to ask and answer other questions. For example, if sea levels rose over 30 metres or 100 feet, it would cause an impact to the landscape. And in fact, the sea levels rose more than that. In fact, in some places, over a longer period, they rose as much as 120 metres or 400 feet since the glacial maximum 20,000 years ago. And this is not only because the ice caps melted, raising the sea levels, but a 1 mile thick layer of ice on land will weigh the land down, actually push Earth's crust down. And then it will also make other adjoining pieces of land, which are not covered in ice, raise up. And so when the ice caps melted as the Ice Age finished, some land masses lowered and some rose as quickly as the sea level changed. We can say with 100% confidence the landscape of the Earth changes as sea levels rise and as the ice caps and glacial maximums retreat. And this leads us to the next question, which is, would humans notice this change in the landscape even if it was over an extended period of time, over many generations? Now, one academic who has studied these stories and landscapes which change due to geological events is Patrick Nunn. And one of the stories he tells is when he was travelling back to the main island of Fiji from Motuiki, and at one point in the journey, at a place called Devatatambu, everyone in the boat stopped and fell silent and bowed their heads as they travelled over what is the deepest part of the sea between these Fijian islands. But what was happening? Well, the islanders were giving their thoughts and respect to the spirits who dwelled on the ocean floor, who lived on a submerged land called Vunivi Levu. And this experience captivated the curious mind of Patrick Nunn. Patrick has also spent time researching in Britain and has found a story told in the Orkney Islands, on the island of St Kilda. This story is first recorded in 1697 and tells of a warrior who lived on there and who travelled between the hills of St Kilda and those of the island of Harris. However, on their travels between the two islands we see today, a boat was not used. Instead, the story tells of how the warrior hunted deer across a vast stretch of land, with no islands in sight. And the last time these two islands were joined by land was 8,000 years ago. Surely such a story could not have been made up, for there's no reason to do that. And so perhaps this is a story from a time before sea levels rose. There are other stories about lost landscapes. For example, if we go to the Spencer Gulf area of Australia, there we find the Naranga people of York Peninsula, who within their stories recall a time when there was no Spencer Gulf, only a marshy country reaching inland, lying just above the ocean surface, and which was covered with freshwater lagoons, and here the birds and other animals flocked. But one day the sea came in, perhaps through the breaching of a natural barrier, and the marshland became submerged under the sea. Why do they tell this story? Well, there is a good chance that this story is referring to a flooding event across the outermost lip of the Spencer Gulf, which today now lies around 50 metres or 150 feet below the current sea level. And if this is the case, then this story probably originated as long ago as 12,000 years. And even if you think the story just refers to the flooding of the very highest part and the very last part of the marshland, then the story is, well, at least 8,000 years old. There is also another story from the region where Ngunduri, the name of a man who wanders, travels along the south coast of Australia and talks about the landscape which he walks across. His story highlights geographical areas that are now lost to us as they talk of the landscape when the sea levels were lower. The islands we see today are not there. They are part of the land, as the seafloor of today was the land of yesterday. And there are many of these stories in Australia, with this image indicating that the coastline of Australia was far more extensive than it is today. But why are these stories remembered by the First Nation Australians? Well, on top of the core reasons for why stories persist, these people were isolated for so long, it allowed their stories to remain relatively intact with no external influences forcing them to change. And whilst these stories don't describe a flood as we would usually perceive it, a world reborn, they do describe a landscape before a rise in sea levels over thousands of years. But can we prove this? We have the stories and can confirm the sea level rise through geology, but is there any other evidence our ancestors knew about the rise in sea levels? Well, there are certain parts of the world that have suffered sea level rise more than others, partly because of the glacial bounce effect, and northwestern Europe is one of those places, with land masses such as Doggerland slowly disappearing since the end of the last ice age. But it was finally put to rest, permanently erased, probably following a tsunami, the Storga Slide tsunami, which was around 8,200 years ago. Now, not far from Doggerland are the Carnac lines of France. Now, many historians and archaeologists have visited this site because it is an amazing and huge site, but many say they have no idea why kilometres of menhirs were arranged in lines. But I want to put it to you that if you know your geology and myth, then you may have a similar thought to myself and perhaps other mythologists. Now, we know that along this coastline settlements have been consumed by sea level rise, and the communities who lived in them would have experienced this rise over time. And there are traces of sea defences starting to be built here from prehistory. And alongside these physical barriers to control water, there almost certainly would have been religious or spiritual barriers. Now, this can be hard to imagine, but if you stand between the menhirs and watch the sheep wander by, you can wonder why such long lines of stones sit in a field, and why lines of stones and stone circles are also found in the sea close by, as Carnac is right by the coast. Now, some may say that they are ancestor worship, each stone a tribute to a fallen warrior. Others may say they mark a boundary between cultures. But what if the stones, well, they mark a magical, metaphysical barrier between the land and the sea to stop the gods of the sea taking over the land? It is a theory that seems to fit well, although one we will never be able to confirm, very much speculative, but desperate times call for desperate measures, and the building of such an impressive array of stones reflect this. Perhaps a brief but significant rise in sea level happened, which kick-started the construction of this site around 6,500 years ago. But whatever it was for, whatever your personal opinion, it was all for nothing, as we find the sea consumed some of the stones. Now, you might think, looking at these stones, how could they ever be thought to be able to prevent the sea from consuming the land? But you're thinking like a 21st century person, with 21st century knowledge. The cosmos and the world within it 6,500 years ago was a very different place in the mind of our ancestors, and these many years were, well, probably thought of as, well, holding an energy. Think of them more like the bones of the Earth Mother, as in the Indo-European creation myth. These stories I've talked about are a reflection of the rise in sea levels. These are not stories where the rain causes flooding, where the earth is reborn. Stories that were written among the first written down in East Asia and Europe. But we also see a story in China where the flood recedes, and this is the Chinese flood myth known as the Great Flood or the Gun Yu myth. It is looked upon as a world reborn story which tells of how a devastating flood reshaped the world and affected the lives of early Chinese people. The heroes, Gun and Yu, attempt to control the floodwaters by creating channels to the sea for the floodwaters to flow out. And the results of their efforts is the birth of the Zhai dynasty. But if we look at the archaeological evidence, then we see this story probably relates to a huge flood around 4,000 years ago in 1920 BCE. And so we have a flood story. We have a story of rain and a flood subsiding, which has correlating geological evidence. But then, what of the Near East, home to the Epic of Gilgamesh and Noah's Ark? Do we have geological evidence of any flooding here? And the answer is yes, with the city of Shuruppak, one of the antediluvian cities in Mesopotamian myth, a city that was before the floods and home of King Utnapishtim. Now, although Utnapishtim is a mythical figure, it is not actually thought he was a real living being. As if he was, he wouldn't have died, as he was immortal. But having survived the flood in the myth, we find some, again, self-appointed ancient history experts say that the archaeological evidence found at the site proves that there was a catastrophic flood affecting the whole region, citing a 3-metre or 20-foot thick sedimentary deposit found through excavation, and suggesting that this proves stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Noah's Ark. Some even say that below this deposit is evidence of an advanced lost civilization, and it has been found under this layer, and this evidence being, well, over 20,000 years old. But the fact is, there is a 1930 or 1931 archaeological report by Eric Schmidt of the University of Pennsylvania that records this layer of flood deposits and concludes that this occurred at the end of the Jemdet-Nessar period. The cause? Probably an occurrence of a river avulsion, a common process in the Tigris and Euphrates, and this is even noted in the archaeological notes. And for the record, the end of the Jemdet-Nessar period is around 2900 BCE, and the Jemdet-Nessar period is known for not containing any advanced or lost civilization. Now, this archaeology raises a useful point about flooding, that river avulsions were not uncommon in the history of the Tigris and the Euphrates, the key rivers running through Mesopotamia, and which start as far north as Turkey and go all the way to the Persian Gulf, which itself is only a thing that came into being in the last 20,000 years or so. Now, in case you are unaware, river avulsion is where a river changes course rapidly. It is quite a specialist subject, and I can link to a paper below if you're interested in understanding it further. But in practical terms, it is where perhaps we see a fork in the river suddenly closing, allowing only one outlet to flow. And this outlet will then flow with more water and with a higher force. Or, more well known, are where there are bends in a river, which are then straightened. And it looks like this did affect Shuruppak 5,000 years ago, and so may have contributed as an influence to the flood myths and the flood stories of the region. But the world, nor sort of greater region, was reset as per flood myths. We also know the Nile flooded most years, and that means it was a regular feature in the Fertile Crescent. People knew of this, the birthplace of the first agricultural farmers. And this flooding helped provide fresh nutrients to the farmlands, by the rivers. They were necessary for farming to be as successful as it was. In fact, whilst there were floods, many stories we have in the region are not about floods, but about the lack of water and droughts. Either way, it feels like the local flooding was accepted, was an accepted part of life of an agricultural farmer. And if farming has been happening over 10,000 years, then perhaps the flood story, the one where the world is reset, is older than that. But let's take a segue by talking briefly about the drought myths, as there are two major types of story in the region of the Fertile Crescent that are related to droughts. The first is that of the storm god and the dragon, a story we see in a number of forms, but the plot usually goes: the land needs rain, and so the storm god fights and defeats the dragon to get control of the water, and so allowing it to rain. And this increased the importance of the storm god in agricultural pantheons, and so they were sometimes either elevated to the role of chief god, or the chief god took on the properties of the storm god for this reason. But why defeat a dragon? Well, that is because the dragon has always been a controller of water up until this time, although usually for benevolent reasons, usually for good. But if humans wanted water and they weren't getting it, then it made sense that the dragon was now bad, a malevolent being, the possessor of the thing we desired most, and it wasn't giving it to us. And so that was why there was this myth where the storm god went into the clouds, slapped dragon about with various magical weapons, and if all went well, it rained. Indra versus Vritra is a good example of this in the Rig Veda, Book 1, Hymn 32, with line 8 saying something along the lines of, "There as Vritra lies, like a bank-bursting river, the waters taking courage flow above him. The dragon lies beneath the feet of torrents which Vritra, with his greatness, had encompassed." But there is also another kind of mythology about breaking a drought, which takes the form of someone taken to the underworld. This being, often associated with agriculture, is trapped and they needed to be rescued, and when they return, the rains begin. And we sometimes see rituals of crying implied, and this crying was like a sacrificial ritual to allow the god to go free, and again it influenced the weather so it would rain. But it is not just in the Near East where stories of droughts were told. We see the tale of Tidilik, the frog, from the First Nation Australians, where a frog swallows all the water in the land and various animals try to make the frog laugh to release the water, and eventually it is the writhing, squirming eel that succeeds in making the frog laugh, and, well, water is released. And I'll link to a paper by John Moulton about this tale if you would like to know more. So putting this all together so far, from everything we can see, not all flood myths are the same. And knowing this leads us to an interesting thought, and that is that if many cultures are telling flood stories, many of which are different, and there is also no evidence for a worldwide flood during the last 100,000 years, then are the stories that are being told a response of individual cultures across the world who have experienced flooding and local devastation? Or was there a major flood that affected early modern humans over 100,000 years ago, so massive and terrible it gave rise to a flood story, and this story dispersed around the world as humans migrated to different continents over tens of thousands of years? And then this story evolved and adapted with the landscape as people settled into a farming lifestyle influenced by local flooding events. Now, to answer this, we can collect a good sample of our oldest flood stories from across the world. Stories noted down before the cultures became too influenced by external factors such as religious missionaries, and then analyse those stories for clues. Because if we have such stories, we can use something called the phylogenetic method to understand the probability of these stories being related, to understand how old they may be, and to understand where these stories may have began. Now you may be wondering, phylogenetics, what is that? Well, phylogenetics is like finding footprints in the snow. You may not be able to see who made them, but you can tell what size feet the person had. And you can tell where that person was going, you can tell where that person came from, and you can roughly get an idea of the speed that person was walking at and perhaps how tall they are. So there's lots of information available to us just by looking at these footprints in the snow. And so when it comes to mythology, we can look at all the major flood myths in the world, and we can break them down into their mythemes, the smallest chunks of story that can have meaning, because these small pieces are less likely to be transformed during translations and cross cultural borders and transmission, meaning they retain their core information for longer and further, and that allows us to have a higher confidence and a higher probability when comparing stories from different times and places. Now, using maths and some specifically designed computer programs, the relationships between mythemes in the flood stories can be understood, and from this a probability of their relationship with other stories can be understood. And if we then map what we know about linguistic evolution and human migration onto a map of where these stories were told, this gives us a probability map of a story's possible evolution across a landscape. This would be a probabilistic map of how the flood story evolved and from where it probably started, and this in turn would allow us to look at the archaeological evidence of the time and place to see if we can find tangible evidence to support this. To answer the question, was there a huge and terrifying flood in the area? And this is exactly why looking at historical stories, narratives, mythology can be very useful in understanding what has happened in prehistory. You see, to me, if there was a worldwide flood during the times of modern man, then understanding the origin of the flood myth would be straightforward. There was a worldwide flood, and that was the cause. But we can see from the examples I've given that there are a number of flood myth types, from rising sea levels to angry dragons, from kidnapped gods to frogs swallowing water. And so to use geological evidence and archaeological records to come up with a single unified theory of the flood myth is impossible. There isn't one. The evidence does not allow it, other than the underlying fact that humans, whilst needing water to live, don't like living with too much or too little water. But that is too broad a plot point to consider the de facto flood story. The fact there are such different types of flood stories pushes back against the idea that there was a single flood myth from which all derived. And this is why we should look at the different kinds of flood stories in the world to see if we can categorise these myths and see if the different categories are linked, or if they dispersed, causing similar flood stories to be told over different regions of the world. Now, before we look at the results of this research in detail, I would like to acknowledge the work of Jean-Loïc le Quellec, who has collected over 700 different flood stories and has provided much information to help research in this area. And if you can read French, then I can recommend his book on the subject Avant nous le déluge, which means before us the flood. And then there is also another French academic, Julien, who has also written papers about flood myths using phylogenetic analysis to help find its origin. I would also like to take this moment to thank all the YouTube members and patrons who support my work, for not only does it enable me to carry out better research, it also allows me to develop the Mythology and Folklore database, a tool which I use myself to study folklore and myths, and which is also used by academics and authors and storytellers around the world. The database can be found at mythologydatabase.com and allows you to search for flood myths or stories with an arc, for example, and examine mythemes and motifs of these stories and see how they are distributed across the world. And this is free. But if you wish to and want to support my work in this space, then please consider joining Patreon or YouTube members, as the support helps tremendously. Now, one thing the study of folklore, and particularly mythology, tells us is that stories change, normally to reflect changes in society or in the landscape. But the core mythemes of a story rarely do, hence why we see dragons controlling water and needing to be beaten in battle by a storm god to release that water, as a story across the Near East and into India. The same core story exists, just the details have changed. And the reason for this story is that before agricultural farming, dragons were seen as the givers of water and life, the primordial beings that created the earth and life in many cultures. But when water wasn't given by the clouds, when people needed it, then the dragon was blamed and so had to be defeated by the storm god, as why else would lightning and thunder exist in the world if it was not, the battling between, these two mythical figures. And this is how myths adapt to answer questions about the world we live in, and to give answers the cultures telling the stories have already thought about, but which could now be projected as being told by the gods, giving those stories a sense of legitimacy. One other point I would like to make before we get into the details of the research is that I have called these stories flood myths and flood stories, but from an academic viewpoint, these stories are folklore, a term that can be used to encompass all stories which are told by people, whereas mythology is part of folklore, a genre that contains sacred truths, and so are religious stories containing gods and cosmogonic elements. But just because a myth is a sacred truth, it doesn't mean it's factually correct. It is only considered correct by those who believe in the gods and the cosmogony of the myth. And so flood myths are stories with gods and so encompass the reset of the world, a cosmogonic event, whereas stories about sea level rising are more likely just flood stories or folklore, maybe with a hint of historical fact. Now, this may seem like a minor thing to note, but in the world of the folklorist, such nuances can cause many arguments due to the fact there is no formal agreement in the definition of what is a myth or what is folklore or what is a legend. So it's just worth noting for the record that I am aware of this. So if any folklorists are in the comments arguing me, that's not a myth, that's a myth, that's laying it out on the line for you what's going on. And so with that, let's talk about the real flood mythology, these stories where the world resets like a creation myth, as that's the kind of flood myth people often think about, like Noah's Ark. And I feel the best place to start is for me to tell you about a few of these myths, to give us a starting point, to show you the footprints in the snow, so to speak, from which we can trace the mythology. Now, there are flood stories in many cultures, but that doesn't mean flood myths are the most popular myths. I even had a comment recently telling me flood myths were even more common than that of the hero's journey, and this is just not true. Certainly based on the hundreds of thousands of narratives in the mythology database, we see the hero's journey in around 25% of narratives, but the flood mytheme is in less than 1% of them. And if you want to know what is the most popular mytheme, it is around fleeing or escaping from danger. So now you know. Anyway, with that, let me tell you a few of the better known flood myths. Now, the first example is from the Viking sagas and poems, and it is found within the Prose Edda, a book about Old Norse mythology and poetry from Scandinavia, and which was written by a Christian, Snorri Sturluson. Now, in this story, the primordial being, Ymir, is killed, so his body or his body parts can be used to build the world. And the story goes on to say, "And when Ymir fell, so much blood flowed from his wounds that with it drowned all of the Jötnar," who were the monstrous beings living on the world, often misrepresented as giants, but it is better to say that, well, they are monstrous beings. Anyway, it continues, "So I drowned all the Jötnar, except one that escaped with his household. Giants call him Belgemir. He and his wife went to his ark and were saved, and from them are descended the families of all Jötnar." Now, what is interesting about this is that we see homologies within the Indo-European creation myth relating components of the material world linked to that of the primordial being. Rocks are bones, hair is grass, flesh is the soil, blood is the water, and the seas and the oceans. And so the blood of Ymir flowing can be analogous to waters flowing. And these three lines within this version of the Old Norse creation myth are a flood motif, and the race of the Jötnar are reborn. But whilst there are similarities in this story to the biblical texts, the aspects of the story that can be considered mythemes, such as animals are rescued and it rained for a period of time, these are missing. And this is important, as if we can identify which flood stories are biblical, then we can look at the stories around the world and see if they are similar. And then they will, need to be considered as being spread by missionaries and not dispersed with earlier migration. In effect, you have to be aware of there is temporal significance in the dispersal of stories. But I'll come to that again in a little while, because that is part of the consideration of the research. Anyway, either the Old Norse story has come from a much earlier source than the Bible, or much later than the Bible, to consider these mythemes missing. Now, one of the mythemes in the biblical story of Noah is a motif we refer to as bird scout, or scout bird, which is motif reference C5A in the Berezkin Analytical Catalogue, if you want to look it up in the Mythology database. Now, this bird scout is the part of the story where Noah releases a dove to find land, and it comes back with an olive branch to show that floodwaters are receding and land is now available. Now, what is very interesting is that there is another motif called the earth diver, Berezkin motif C6D, and in this there is a bird which dives to the bottom of a primordial sea, and so a world before land even exists, and at the bottom of the sea it gets a beak full of mud and brings it to the surface of the sea. Now there, the mud turns into land, a small island, and this process of creating land sees the earth diver represented in many creation myths across the world. Now, these two motifs, the bird scout and the earth diver, are very similar. Both birds, both travelling in search for land, except one bird travels downwards into the water and the other travels across the water. And then this leads to the question, did the story of the earth diver lead to the bird scout, or did the story of the bird scout lead to the earth diver? Which way round was it? Now, to find out, we need to understand the distribution of these motifs, which is something the Mythology database can show you. And if we look at the distribution of the earth diver motif, we see it predominantly in North America, with some distribution in Eastern Europe and South Asia. And if we look at the higher level motif of diving for land, which includes the earth diver, then we see a similar distribution but with more stories, but also a significant dispersal across Siberia, which is interesting and makes sense at a high level, as it could represent that the motif dispersed from Central Asia went into West Europe and east across Thuringia and then into the Americas, where we also see it. Now, if we look at the distribution of the scout bird from myths such as Noah's Ark, we see a different distribution in the Americas, with more representation in Central and Southern America and less occurrences across Eastern Europe and Southern Asia. And for those who are interested in doing their own research, then there is actually a way to compare these motifs in the Mythology database. And this map shows the earth diver is, by far the more popular motif, with Central and South America being the places where bird scout is and earth diver is not. Now, this could suggest that the bird scout is older than the earth diver myth, as it may well have come into the Americas first. But with the earth diver being a creation myth, not a flood myth, for it to be younger than a flood myth of the bird scout turning into a creation myth with the earth diver, well, that just doesn't make sense. We would expect creation myths to turn into flood myths, not flood myths to turn into creation myths. It's part of the phylogenetic method. You rarely see myths devolve, they normally evolve. But there is more data on flood myths to examine, and this is a good time to leverage input from Quellec and drough. Now, before their detailed research began, the potential to encounter several issues concerning data had to be addressed, and in particular there is this issue regarding the temporal context of narratives, or how old is a story really. We must give consideration to whether a narrative was disseminated in recent history. An example of this could be a scenario in which Spanish Christian missionaries introduced the flood myth to South American populations during the 16th and 17th centuries. And it is plausible then that this version of the myth is then being recalled by South American cultures rather than a more ancient prehistoric variant. And this hypothesis can be applied globally, but especially in regions where Christianity spread or where colonisation has occurred. And this is another reason why mythemes and motifs are critical in the study of folklore, as by looking at the structure of the myths in these regions, it was found that many of the flood stories around the world do not appear to be related to the biblical or Islamic versions of the flood myth, although some of the myths found amongst the First Nation Americans in the northern continent are close, and particularly the Amerindian myths are found amongst the Andamans, and this leads to a theory that they may have been influenced by external Christian influences coming into the America in recent centuries. However, we also see that in most flood myths in the Americas, they have no biblical influence, and so were not an evolution of myths spread by Christians. And so the question to ask is, did the flood myths being told in America start in America, or did they come to America in the earliest migrations of humans? And if they came in the first migrations, then this would be proof that at least some of the flood myths originate from a minimum of 14,000 years ago, as that is when the last of these first migrations happened, towards the end of the last ice age. And if that is the case, then the myth must have diffused from a source outside of the Americas, which would then lead to a number of hypotheses for that source, including Central Asia, Southeast Asia, or even Africa during the out of Africa migrations, if the myth can be shown to be over 45,000 years old. One of the papers Julien produced is called Between Heaven and Earth, and this was based on all the motifs in Berezkin's catalogue that concerned the flood. Now, there was another study which is referenced called a Cosmogonic dive story from the Upper Paleolithic, which is based on using an entire section of catastrophe motifs from Berezkin's catalogue, as these would also include flood myths. Analysis of the dissemination of flood narratives represented by these revealed a global pattern in the distribution of mythological motifs, which aligns approximately with the northern and southern hemispheres of the Earth. From this, it was seen that where motifs occur across the southern hemisphere, and so specifically in Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia and South America, they could be reflective of the mythology that was in transmission during the last significant Homo sapien migration out of Africa, as represented in the most recent models of out of Africa. So consequently, if a motif is present in both South America and Africa, it will be between 47 and 55,000 years old minimum. Although, so it may also be significantly older, as this motif could have been told in Africa for many thousands of years before them. But in the northern hemisphere, the flood motifs appear to reflect transformations and developments that occurred during the transmission of mythologies whilst in Eurasia, and these motifs were then subsequently introduced to North America during the second significant wave of migration to the continent. And as an aside, research indicates that there were 4 separate but significant migrations into the Americas during the time of the existence of Beringia, the landmass caused by the Ice Age approximately 22 to 15,000 years ago. Now, this conclusion of a second wave dissemination is also supported by the presence of a cluster of similar motifs in both Eurasian and North American regions, and so having the same source. And because most migrations were heading from Asia into the Americas, the source would have been somewhere in the Eurasian continent. This evidence is also backed up by the existing population in America from the first migration, as they were either assimilated and converted to tell the new flood myth, or they were pushed further south. And so the hypothesis that this diffusion occurred during the second migration is based on the fact that this migration originated from northern Eurasia, and this can also be confirmed through DNA analysis. In effect, the people who were already in America, if not assimilated, migrated towards Central and South America, which we can evidence. But the story of the dispersal of the flood myth doesn't end there. As the data shows, there was then independent flood myth development in Eurasia, which then migrated back into northern Africa. And this is consistent with other phylogenetic studies of mythology, such as the Cosmic Hunt. In effect, humans were not migrating one way out of Africa, and we see a development of new myths and probably a new view of cosmogony as part of this, in effect the seeds of a type of new religion. The best way to explain all this is through an animation, which is not trying to show the dispersal of a specific myth, but instead it explains the overall diffusion pattern that is regularly seen with mythology as a story migrates out of Africa and around the world. First, the myth starts in Africa, represented by the pink colorization, and this myth spreads across Africa. Then it spreads across towards Asia, and with the last major Homo sapien migration out of Africa, although we do know humans had left Africa before this time, but not in a dispersal event that left any Homo sapiens alive today, not outside of sub-Saharan Africa anyway. Now, the myth then spreads into East and Central Asia, as well as Europe, before eventually covering much of Eurasia and the land towards Australia. But this is where things get interesting. We see the myth go to Australia, starting to migrate over the Bering Strait into North America, and also from Oceania into Australia. And from Oceania it eventually crosses the Pacific into South America. But also at this time a new motif of this myth starts to appear in Eurasia, represented by the green colorization. And this motif takes over as the main motif of the myth due to the Northern Eurasians assimilating some of the existing cultural stories. At this point, the original myth is diffusion across the Americas and Australia, whilst the second motif is now growing in Eurasia. Eventually, the first myth is dominant in the Americas, Africa and Southeast Asia, and down to Australia, but the second motif is now spreading across northern Eurasia and crossing the Bering Strait into the Americas. And here the second motif starts replacing the first before we end up in the position we see today, with the Eurasian motif entering back into Africa and being dominant in North America and most of Eurasia, whilst the first motif is in South America, Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and into Australia. And this is the general theory about how most myths travel when they come from out of Africa. And we can see aspects of this in the results from the studies about the flood myth. And so the research that used this technique selected 10 key motifs, and I will use the Berezkin catalogue references so your motif is known and you can find them in the Mythology database in case you wish to look at the motifs in more detail in your own time. So let me explain these motifs, what their stories are about and their distributions. And once we have understood these, we can then look at what can be concluded from these distributions and stories. Now, the initial focus was on the Earth Diver motif C6D and its variants C6A and C6C, which are Earth Diver / Getting Land motifs, where the diving creature is usually a bird, but sometimes a frog or a turtle. The Earth Diver motif involves an individual or creature who descends to the ocean depths or an underworld, but not to an otherworld or a realm of the deceased, and there retrieves an object, often mud, and then this is brought to the surface where it forms a small island that then expands due to various reasons, and it then becomes a huge land on which animals and humans can arrive or emerge. And sometimes these come from the underworld, under rocks and trees and alike. Now, this motif is believed to have originated in northern Eurasia, possibly Siberia, and then spread into North America. Now, additionally, motif C2, which combines flood and fire, was examined. In this motif, the world is initially destroyed by fire or wind, and then by a flood, which in some narratives may consist of fire or boiling water rather than rainwater. This subsequent event eradicates the effects of the first, which in turn facilitates a fresh beginning for the world. Now, this motif is thought to have spread from Southeast Asia and into North America, as well as through Oceania and then across into South America. Then we have motif C4, fruits fall from a tree into water, often as a result of a flood at the beginning of time. And in these stories, typically it is a person who has climbed a tree who is dropping fruits, seeds or other objects into the water. And as these objects fall, the water recedes, revealing dry land. And this is primarily found in South America, although there are some interesting examples found in Southeast Asia, suggesting that that could be an origin point for it. Then we have motif C34, which is called Flood Wounded Creature. Now, this is a motif which involves the killing, injuring or offending of a water creature, which usually possesses special properties, and it is the effect of injury on the animal which allows it to trigger a deluge of rain, which in turn results in a flood. Now, this motif's distribution suggests that it spread from Southeast Asia to South America. And then we have motif C5A, scout bird, a well-recognised motif, familiar to many from the biblical flood narrative. Now, in this motif, birds or humans who later transform into birds are dispatched to explore the earth to ascertain the existence of land and the presence of survivors or the sight of smoke rising in the sky. And then they will return with soil or vegetation indicating that the floodwaters are receding and that there is fertile land present. Now, this has been disseminated from some occurrences in Southeast Asia and in part the southern part of North America through Central America and into South America. Now, the penultimate motif in this research is C8, referred to as brother and sister give birth to people. And this depicts a scenario at the beginning of time or following a global catastrophe such as a flood, where a brother and sister, or occasionally a mother and son, are sole human survivors. They subsequently establish a family from which the rest of humanity descends, and C8's distribution is more focused on Southeast Asia as well as in North and South America. And finally, there is motif C19, finding the sun, which describes the arduous process by which primeval ancestors obtained the concealed or stolen sun or daylight as part of the mythological narrative. Now, the distribution of C19 seems quite widespread, with occurrences in Southeast Asia, North and South America, as well as Africa. However, there's also a significant amount of distribution in Europe. And in conjunction with this motif, C32, nail ship, is examined, as this motif attributes special significance to cut off nails or hair concerning the fate of the soul in the afterlife or the future of the world. The act of cutting a soul's nails or hair is believed to precipitate a flood, and C32 is rooted in northern Eurasian origins. And so, if we consider these motifs and diffusion, what can we say about the probable origin and age of the flood myth? Well, the first theory is that the flood myth is an evolution of the earth diver myth, a myth that looks to have started in the Upper Paleolithic period. An analysis of the motif dispersal would suggest a migration of the myth from northern Eurasia eastwards through northeast Asia before crossing Beringia and into North America. And looking at America, it is very clear that two migration events occurred in which different flood myths was brought with them. The second migrations culture was a more dominant culture, and this caused an eradication of the first flood myth from much of North America, pushing it into Central and South America. And so the data is really clear that the first diffusion of the mythology would have reached both North and South America, but this mythology would have only survived centrally in the southern hemisphere, as the second migration with the earth diver superseded the first one in the northern hemisphere. The study also identified a correlation between the motifs earth diver and fruits fall from a tree, tracing their origins to a Southeast Asian root. Notably, within Berezkin's database there exists another motif designated as E5A titled Mankind Ascends from the Underworld. This suggests that the earth diver motif is likely a transformation of Mankind Ascends from the Underworld motif, and this seems to be one of the oldest creation myths we know. And I say creation in quotes, as nothing is created in this myth, it is just put together. In fact, let me clarify this by describing the motif. The story starts with humans having already been created but not put on the earth, and the initial people, most often referred to as first men or first women, were not created in the traditional sense but emerged onto the earth from the underworld, or occasionally from within a tree trunk or from under a rock. And this emergence is emblematic of the genesis of humanity and of life on earth, representing a creation myth devoid of creation, actual creation. In these narratives, there is a barrier that has to be crossed. In technical terms, there needs to be a rupture of an occlusion to break through a membrane of earth or water, and it is this action that facilitates the emergence of life on Earth. Now, further to this, there is an observed inversion between those beings, including animals and humans, that live on the Earth when compared to those below it. And this narrative is an interesting look back at the minds of our ancestors and how they considered life on Earth to have begun. And when we study the mythemes of these stories, the component parts, we can have strong confidence that mankind ascends from the underworld, transformed over time to the earth diver motif, and then that in turn transformed into the fruits fall from a tree motif. The connection is that all these motifs exhibit some form of vertical movement, either ascending or descending. Life originates from either above or below, and the world initially exists in a state of emptiness. The emergence of life, or the emergence of an element that multiplies, is evident in this context. And we can also tell by the fact that the earth diver motif has its roots in a North Asian diffusion, and the fruits fall from a tree motif is in a Southeast Asian diffusion, which suggests there was a common transformation of this after humans left Africa 45 to 55,000 years ago. And so it should be pointed out that the earth diver motif was originally considered a primordial ocean myth, not a flood myth, and so certain methodologies used in the study would not have picked this up. And this should be noted where future research takes place. So I hope that makes sense. There is an evolution of a myth from creation into a flood myth, in effect. Now, the phenomenon described as a fire and flood, if we talk about that appears to have extended to both North and South America during the initial wave of human settlement, as reconstructed with the earliest populations of these continents. The migrations are correlated to the diffusion of the myth. And it should also be noted that the cosmos exists in these cycles, such as creation, destruction, and creation again. And this is almost unheard of in African mythology. This gives the research confidence that the motif emerged in narratives after the out of Africa migration, and so younger than the earth diver motif. Now, there was evidence to suggest that this motif was constructed at the time of migration into North America, although we cannot be sure whether it was known in pre-existing Siberian populations before going into North America. But this would make the sense, as there are many myths in Eurasia which have a creation, destruction, creation again cycle. Now, wherever the origin of this myth is, this was not the first myth that talked about floods and the rebirth of land or humans after it. Now, the motif concerning the act of killing, injuring or offending a water creature, thereby triggering a deluge, has been reconstructed in Southeast Asia. And this motif may have been associated with two other motifs that were reconstructed prior to the out of Africa migration. And so it is therefore possible that this motif evolved from either mythological snakes guard water sources releasing water only under specific conditions, and mythological snakes can produce rain and or storms, as referenced in earlier work by drough. And links to the motif that dragons and water are connected have been going since the earliest of times, since modern man probably started telling stories. And we even see in Michael Witzel's book on the world's oldest mythologies that this diluvian motif belongs to a very ancient stratum of mythology. And I've shown in my own work some of our earliest myths have this serpent associated with water to create the earth, such as the South African rain snake or the Australian rainbow serpent. And if you're interested in learning more specifically about this, then I'd recommend watching this video, The Oldest Dragon Myths and Their Origins. It's a video with over 500,000 views and 98% of people seem to have liked it. So it's a really good and interesting watch if you haven't seen it yet. And so this should have us asking questions such as, did the flood myth come from Africa? And one of the issues with this is that there is a lack of narrative data from Africa for us to evidence anything conclusively. We do see the scout bird narrative, C5a, in one African region, and one study has observed the motif in Australia, a continent that was populated early in human history and which remained isolated for an extended period of time. Now, this suggests that there was a possibility that this motif was disseminated during the initial major expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa, and so it is plausible that this motif, and by extension the flood myth itself, may have been recounted in Africa prior to the first significant migrations from the continent. Now, if this hypothesis holds true, it challenges the notion that the myth originated as a result of the Younger Dryas, or the melting of the glacial maximum of the last ice age, potentially predating these events by 20 or 30,000 years. However, the study also concluded that due to the limited number of flood-related motifs in Africa, coupled with the absence of motifs commonly reconstructed at the root of both African and Southeast Asian areas, the hypothesis of a diffusion of flood myths with the out-of-Africa migrations lacks statistical support. Thus, Africa is unlikely to be the source of the flood myth. This does not preclude some of the possibilities that some flood motifs originated in Africa, but it is noteworthy that the small number of motifs found in Africa were all from a single region and would bias the out-of-Africa theory if misapplied. And this consideration was factored into the study's conclusion. Now, it was also hypothesised that the bird scout motif was originated in a different story and subsequently incorporated into flood myth narratives in Eurasia before spreading. However, this hypothesis remains unproven. So, if Africa was not the source of the flood myth, then how about the Americas? Now, reconstruction of the initial Amerindian motifs was determined to be less reliable compared to other regions, partly due to limited data, which is a similar situation to the one found in Africa. And so, if not managed correctly, it could introduce bias into the data. And further to this, and due to the dispersal of motifs to other regions, such as Eurasia, and this being unlikely, it's rare you get narratives flow from America into Eurasia at that time. The American motifs were considered were considered not a probabilistic source of flood myths. What we can say is the data also indicated clearly that Central Asia is not the origin of the flood myth. It was instead a region where motifs traversed, particularly from Southeast Asia, and it is in Southeast Asia that numerous flood motifs appear to have originated. And when the data is considered in conjunction with the data of Central Asian motifs, we find similar motifs are found in Oceania and South America. And this would be the case if initial human migrations took these myths with them from Southeast Asia upwards towards Beringia and downwards towards Oceania and South America. So Southeast Asia looks like a promising source for many flood myths. I started this video wondering about whether there was a global flood myth which made everybody tell a flood myth story. And I've clearly shown that this was not the case. With different motifs from different times and with different plots and mythemes and motifs, some resetting the world, some not. The flood myth is not 10,000 years old and not every culture tells it. And if anyone says that, they're talking nonsense. I then suggest that people experience floods all over the world, causing the story to be popular. But the story is not as popular as people believe. Less than 1% of narratives mention the flood of some kind, which seems odd for something that is deemed so significant. However, I am convinced that sea level rises over the last 20,000 years, caused by melting glaciers, the polar ice caps, and including climate changes from the younger Droughts, along with other meteorological and localised geological events, have influenced flood myths and their motifs. But the purpose of this video is not to delve into these influences, but to explore the origins and timing of the flood myth, to find its origins, its start, where, why and when. And as part of this, we came across a story about the first humans on Earth, emerging from within the Earth without a creator, suggesting a time before gods when beliefs of animism likely prevailed, providing the basis for such beliefs. But as for flood myths, the research indicates that while some flood myths contain motifs over 45,000 years old, probably 60 or 70,000 years old, likely originating from Africa with the first major human dispersals, these motifs were probably not part of the flood myths at the time. Instead, they were attached to other stories, other narratives, and evolved and eventually integrated into the flood myths. And it was these flood myths that became the root of the flood myths we know today, originating from Southeast Asia from at least 20,000 years ago, before humans went to America, before the melting ice caps, before the Younger Dryas period. At that time, there was no reason for a flood myth, but a creation myth, especially one involving a primordial ocean. That made sense. This seems logical when considering the world's geography at the time, and the fact that lower sea levels helped facilitate human migration to places such as Australia, well, it sort of made sense that creation myths were the thing. But as sea levels rose and migration paths became flooded by new and larger seas, well, these routes closed off and may have helped influence then the emergence of the flood stories, the flood myths. What is certain is that the flood stories of Noah or of the Epic of Gilgamesh were not the original flood myths, were not part of a large or regional or worldwide flood, and were so geographically distant from the myth's origins as to be considered of zero influence in terms of commonly experienced real events. In short, we see flood myths evolve from humans coming from the underworld, transforming into the earth diver, and then transforming again into someone dropping fruit from a tree. In effect, flood stories we know contain elements of narratives told before we left Africa over 45,000 years ago. But the flood myths we would recognise today probably originated in Southeast Asia, well, around 45,000 years ago, and certainly by 25,000 years ago they were established as humans prepared to cross Beringia. And that is the origin of the flood myth, and when they started, and the why. This was Craig and Ford. Take care.